Saved by the Bell Season 1. This episode is called Save That Tiger. In this episode, they're in a prank war. Zack's hair rating is about a 5. It's very untamed and grown out. What I really like about this episode in particular is that the team is kind of working together and not really against each other. In so many episodes, you see this continuous storyline of Zack and Slater being frenemies. I like when you get a break from that and actually see their friendship blossom. Also, do you notice that none of the characters care about Screech's well-being at all? That's probably why Dustin Diamond was insecure. So oftentimes you'll hear that Belding has a very signature laugh. Well, this principal, the principal from Valley, definitely beat that. Also, Rhonda's back. She was one of the favorite characters from the first episode of Saved by the Bell, which is Dancing to the Max. So I'm surprised that she was in another episode because they never mentioned it before. Also, I have to mention how odd it is that they always have Jesse sitting in backwards in the chair just like Slater. Like almost in all the scenes I've seen it happen, Jesse does it. Here's my takeaway from Zack to the Future, Save That Tiger. I did learn from this podcast that this particular episode was the season finale of Season 1. But as you guys know, Season 1 does continue on. At the end of every season, they do kind of like a high five or like an all-in. So that's how you know which episode signifies kind of like the ending of that season. I think the most memorable thing about this particular podcast is the mention of Screech sniffing his finger twice in one scene. It made me want to rewatch that scene. And the dream sequence where Mark Paul Gosselaar was getting hammered with a pie and being squirted with water balls and stuff. That scene was so hilarious because you can obviously tell that he is basically giggling. And they interviewed Dan from Valley and reveals that Peter liked him so much brought him back to Bayside as Moose. Saved by the Bell, Close Encounters of the Nerd Kind. Zack's hair rating in this episode is definitely 8. It's not too long, not too short, not too blonde. And I'm very fascinated by the fact that they put him in ugly sweaters all the time. He's like the king of ugly sweaters. Also, look how much older he looks from last episode. So this episode is one of my favorite episodes because it's usually episodes where the friends are working together and not against each other. This episode, they break a school camera, but instead of coming forth and just telling the truth, they decided that they were going to lie and pretend that Screech was an alien so they can get reward money. When the FBI agent goes to Belding's office, you'll notice that they really harp on the trope that Belding is a neat freak. And he gives the FBI agent a file of Zack that was like this thick. But to me, it seems like Zack's file would be thicker. This scene with Zack and Screech, I like that they give us an intimate moment showing us that Zack actually cares about Screech. The way they ran the FBI agent off at the end was the oddest scene. Here's my takeaway from Zack to the Future, Close Encounters of the Nerd Kind. As you can see, they're on episode 28. I'm on episode 18. Don't ask. On one of the things I noticed, they say that Belding's very concerned about not getting the camera back. And they mentioned because they think it's because he has a appointment to make a sex tape. I guess that is kind of something that Belding walked into because he does a lot of kind of sexual jokes. But could it be that other students are actually at that school and need that video camera to do their movies? Dash and Mark Paul are very weirded out that Zack and Screech are sharing a bed together. For the fact that the show has so much toxic masculinity, you would think they would be more open to the fact of the one scene that shows that they're not actually as toxic as we make them out to be. They're kids. It's sweet. They talk about several times about Zack breaking into the school to run schemes. This time I agree with them because it was at night. It was in the dark. In other episodes, I just thought he was there like after school doing after school activities. Saved by the Bell, The Prom. I'm just following what the podcast is doing, so don't crucify me that I skipped like 5 episodes from season 1. Zack's hair rating in this episode is like a 10. This is how I remember Zack when I was growing up. Not too blonde, not too brown, not too overgrown. And there seems to be way less gel in it than in other episodes. Also notice my sweater in honor of this episode. In this episode, Kelly's trying to decide between taking Zack or Slater to the prom. In her dream, she chooses Slater, which actually proves my point that I don't think that Zack is actually Kelly's type. Zack is like the definition of bad boys you love. He will give up the whole world for Kelly. They were Ross and Rachel before Ross and Rachel. So of course you're going to choose the boy that tells you every single time that all he wants is that you to be happy. The dance moves in the 90s though, man. I mean, I just wish I could go back to the 90s because these TikTok dance moves, I can't do them. I could do this. I think this scene is where you really first fall in love with Zack. Also where they had their first kiss. Here's my takeaway from Zack to the Future, The Prom. Their special guest this week was Tiffany Amber Thiessen. An interesting fact that Tiffany mentioned was that Saved by the Bell was filmed twice in a day, with and without a studio audience. To them, it probably felt really theatrical. Tiffany and Mark Paul did also mention that Dustin was so much younger than them that he always felt like an outcast. So I feel like that had something to do with the fact that he wrote that scandalous book about them. Mark Paul is really hilarious in this particular podcast. Sometimes he plays this role of being really defensive towards his character, Zack, and he really drives that point home. He's also what I feel like is like a savage dad, where he like calls out other parents for being like total assholes. He's done it more than once in his podcast, and I'm here for it. He also mentions that one of the scenes, it reminds him of his son. So I Googled him. He's 16 now, and I definitely could see a lot of Zack in him. I think this is a fan favorite episode just because it shows Zack in such a different light. He's actually kind of sweet and not a jerk. Saved by the Bell, Zack's War. In this episode, Zack joins ROTC to get out of detention. Zack's hair rating in this episode is a 9. It's a little bit longer than the back in this episode, so I deducted a point. Interesting enough, this is the first episode that you see Belding actually give Zack permission to manipulate his friends. Very interesting that since Zack is the most popular boy in school, you would think that he would recruit more other athletic kids, but then he decides to recruit nerds instead. One of the first episodes, I see somebody actually trick him into something before he actually tricks them. I don't have a picture, but just go watch the episode and watch Jesse go across the monkey bars. It's like the oddest thing. Another really odd scene is this girl in the background while they're doing the competition. I mean, I know she was there for a reason, but it was just the weirdest thing. I haven't listened to the podcast yet, but I'm really curious to know what Zack actually thinks of this episode. He revealed in an earlier podcast he was part of the cadet corps, so I'm sure he's going to pick this episode apart. I'm also really happy that Screech really got a win in this episode. Here's my takeaway from Zack to the Future, episode 18, Zack's War. You know, I was interested in this podcast just because Mark Paul Gosselaar mentioned in another podcast that he went to cadet school. So I wanted to see what his thoughts were on the particulars, details of this episode. He didn't really have a lot to say, though. I felt like he had some critiques about the salute and shoes being on the mat, but not particularly a lot of criticism, which I was surprised by. Also, they did not mention any of the odd things that I found really odd. You can watch my odd observations in my last video. They did talk at length about this armband, though. Imagine that armband being on this uniform. You can see it right here. And they were very alarmed by that, as you can probably see why. Why did the costume department think that was a good idea? But it also goes to show how hyper aware we are of these type of situations now in today's age. Saved by the Bell, Save the Max. In this episode, they find an abandoned radio station in the basement, and they decide to start back up again. Zack's hair rating in this episode is definitely a 10. It's not as blonde in other episodes, but I really like that his brown hair is peeking through. I always comment on the fact that they always put Zack in ugly sweaters, but they also put him in these crop tops all the time too. Very interesting how they use the fuzzy pink square in this episode as well. Generally, they like to use it for like daydreaming, but in this episode, they use it as kind of a way to go back in time. In this episode, they find out that the Max is owned by the school district, which I guess makes a lot of sense why they kind of use the Max as like their cafeteria. Everybody on this episode has their own segment and own kind of show. However, Slater is the sports broadcaster and he's really bad at it. I've always said that Slater is basically good at everything, but now I know he's not good at one thing, public speaking. On another episode, he freezes on camera as well. One of my favorite episodes, less schemes, more friendships. Zack to the Future, Save the Max. There's a notable joke in this episode about how Slater stinks like a skunk. And Dashiell and Mark Paul are in an argument whether that joke is funny or not. I thought it was hilarious. It's one of those jokes that become funnier over time because it's like an inside joke. You could only understand it if you watch the episode. But I love that they just hammer on that joke like multiple times. It was said like 4 times. They talk a lot about the set in this episode too. A couple of things stood out to me. One, how the DJ set or the basement set was like never used again. However, I do notice that some of the stuff that was in the DJ set, that tall tower with the blinking lights, I think was used again in a theater set. Also, Mark Paul mentions that every season they didn't know if they were renewed, so they had to switch like where they would be filming all the time. That must have been expensive to take down the set and have to like rebuild it in another place. Oddly enough, the people in the richest part of town have the most money problems. Go figure.